We are pleased to have Peter Sarosi here with us. He is a human rights activist and drug policy expert, the founder and editor of the Drug Reporter website since 2004, the author of hundreds of articles, co-author of books, and director of several films about harm reduction, drug policy reform, HIV/AIDS, and hepatitis C and sex work. So welcome up on stage, Peter.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm really grateful for the organizers for inviting me. I have to tell you, I've been to many drug policy conferences before, but I am very impressed by how much Norway has achieved in such a short time. And the significance of this goes beyond Norway, and it keeps inspiring activists in other countries of Europe. And today I'm going to speak about drug policy reform in the European Union and how civil society tries to influence that. My organization has a website, Drug Reporter, which has lots of articles and videos on drug policy and harm reduction. So please go there and you will find tons of videos. So you may ask whether the European Union has a drug policy, a common drug policy at all, because if you look at countries, one country criminalizes drug use, the other country does not. So the EU has no common drug policy in the level of criminal laws, but it has a form of non-binding soft law, which we call the European Drug Strategies and Action Plan. And these European drug strategies are renewed from period to period, and the latest one was adopted in 2021, and it defines the principles and the framework and the goals for prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and supply reduction for European member states. So who is making drug policy in the European Union? Who are the main players? So first of all, it is the European Commission, which is a kind of government of the European Union, and this is what prepares and evaluates the drug strategies. Then the European Parliament discusses and approves the draft drug strategies. Then the main decision-making body is the European Council, and every month all the member states go to Brussels and meet there. We call this the Horizontal Working Party on Drugs, and this is where the decisions are made. But there are other two important players. One is the European Monitoring Center on Drugs and Drug Addiction. It's a Lisbon-based institute that collects information and provides evidence in drug policies. And then there is the Civil Society Forum on Drugs, which I am a member of. And this is the advisory board of the European Commission in drug issues. We have like 45 members for a 3-year term. And this is a very diverse group. So it's not only drug reform organizations are there, but also prohibitionist and recovery organizations. So sometimes it's not easy to reach a consensus there. But there is a consensus on certain issues such as now that we support harm reduction and we support an evidence-based balanced approach to drug policies. And an example that civil society is not just a silent partner, but it has a real role in European drug policies, is the latest EU drug strategy. So despite all the recommendations of civil society, the European Commission last summer came up with a so-called Security Union strategy that included child sexual abuse, drugs, and illegal firearms. And it put drug policy in a kind of war on drugs framework. So we as civil society were quite pissed off, because this is not what we want to see in Europe, the war on drugs approach, fighting drugs and pairing them with child sex abuse. So we criticized it very harshly, and we made some advocacy to member states that they need to reject this document, and finally we were successful. So this document was cancelled, and what we ended up now is a much more progressive European drug strategy that has a priority on human rights and evidence, It approves harm reduction, minimum quality standards for prevention treatment. It approves and promotes drug checking, drug consumption rooms, and naloxone distribution. It has not mentioned decriminalization because there is no consensus on that, but it approves alternatives to coercive sanctions. And what is also important, it promotes that all vulnerable groups have to have the same access to services. So this looks very nice on paper, but how does this translate to reality? And this is something we also do with civil society, so we evaluate how the European drug strategies are implemented in the member states, and I have to tell you that the reality is not as nice as the paper, especially in some countries. So all the evaluations of the EU drug strategies show that, what is the most cost-effective interventions are treatment and harm reduction. But still, member states invest much more money in law enforcement and criminal justice than on treatment. So governments actually keep investing into the least effective interventions of the strategy. And there are serious gaps in accessing harm reduction, especially in the eastern part of Europe. So there is a regional divide. And also, the prevention is mostly poor quality, run by police. And what we always complain about is that harm reduction organizations always have to work according to very strict standards and quality criteria. But when it comes to supply reduction, it's usually like a box-ticking exercise. So how much drug was seized? How many people were arrested? But do we really ask what is the impact of law enforcement on the drug market? So how do they really influence drug markets? And there is no debate on that, and that's what we really would like to change, because just one example of the failure of repressive law enforcement in the previous drug strategy period is ecstasy, the story of ecstasy. I'm sure many of you know this story, that around 2007 in Europe, law enforcement agencies were celebrating as a great success that they blocked chemical precursors from which MDMA and ecstasy is produced in Southeast Asia. And as a consequence, there was a huge shortage of ecstasy in European clubs. But this, of course, did not lead people to stop using drugs at all, but ecstasy was replaced by other drugs, such as PMA or emephedrone. So the drug market diversified, and in a few years, drug traffickers found new chemical precursors from which they could make MDMA. And what we see now is MDMA market is back in shape, it's restabilized, and we have more and more potent ecstasy tablets on the market than ever before, like 2-3 times more potent ecstasy pills. So what really see that this big success of law enforcement was very short term, and then what we see is actually in the end we always end up with more toxic substances, more potent substances. Like, governments always ban new substances, but they never follow up what will be the impact of that on the drug market. And another example is, in several Eastern European countries now, among the marginalized population, cannabis was almost completely replaced by synthetic cannabinoids, as called as spice products, which are much more potent and have a much bigger abuse potential than the natural cannabis plant. And while cannabis had no single overdose deaths, but just in my country last year we had 40 people died from synthetic cannabinoids, and we had like tons of hospital emergencies. So is this really the way how we should deal with with drug policies? As we are always, investing in something which proved to be not effective, and we are expecting different results. So that could be the definition of insanity. And there is always this phrase, or mantra that we have to go after the big fishes and that we have to, catch the big traffickers. But it's not actually the big traffickers who are the biggest fishes, but the banks. And there are several reports, documenting how the banks are laundering money coming from illegal drug trafficking. Just since 2018, at least 18 banks received prosecution agreements so that they get away without any punishment. Just they had an agreement with the prosecutor. How many petty drug dealers have you seen having an agreement with prosecutors and get away with no punishment in the end? So are we really going after the big fishes? And, banks are too big to prosecute them because that will have huge economic impact. And we have to talk about what is a kind of elephant in the room at all current meetings of the EU institutions, and it's like a hot potato, nobody wants to talk about it, is that cannabis legalization is coming to Europe. So when we ask about EU institutions, they are completely scared and freaked out. They don't know what to do with this issue. And now, the real question is really like how this will be regulated. And also another question is if civil society will be involved and the communities will be involved in finding the best way to regulate cannabis. Otherwise, we can end up with a system which is completely dictated by big companies and governments without communities. So we really see, many people talked about that before me, that we have reform initiatives in several European countries. Sometimes it's bottom-up, sometimes it's top-down. Like in Netherlands and Switzerland, there are experiments in the city level. Then we have Luxembourg, where the government announced that they will have a national legalization, just like in Switzerland. We have the cannabis social clubs in Spain, which is a very interesting experiment with cannabis growing collectives, which is a kind of non-commercialized model of legalization of cannabis. So I think it's really time to have a voice as a civil society in this debate and find out the best solutions. It does not mean automatically that it will lead to a spread of reform all over Europe, because we live in a divided continent. So while in Western Europe, in this part of Europe, you see that there are very progressive reforms in drug policy, but this ends when you go to the eastern part of Europe, and that's completely the opposite. So in the eastern part of Europe, there are no reforms, but the policy going to the opposite direction. So it's more repressive than ever, and harm reduction is declining. Unfortunately, just this is an interesting map, like showing how many drug consumption rooms are in Europe. Do you see any in the eastern part of Europe? No. So, and this is the same if you have a map on like distribution of needles and OST and other programs that they, of course, there exist, but the coverage is so slow that that's really not effective at all. And there is a crisis in harm reduction in the eastern part of Europe where I come from, unfortunately. So like 10 years ago, we were filming about beautiful, nice harm reduction centers in Eastern Europe, several countries, needle and syringe programs. Now many of them closed down because there is no funding and there are political attacks against these programs. In my own country, 2014, the two largest needle exchange programs closed down because a mayor attacked them and they blamed them for attracting drug users to the city. In Romania, there was a huge wave of HIV as a consequence of cutting down needle exchange programs. In Bulgaria now, needle exchange completely stopped. There are sometimes shortages of medications for HIV and OST, and this is within the European Union. I'm not even talking about Russia, where there is a drug propaganda law which says that you cannot promote harm reduction, so websites are banned because they say anything positive about needle and syringe programs. So that is the opposite procedure, and there is something we call, the shrinking space for civil society, which is actually a government crackdown on civil society organizations that goes beyond drug policy. We have a movie about that if you would like to learn more about this. It's called Crackdown on Civil Society, and this is like in my country, for example, NGOs who are receiving foreign funds and advocating for progressive issues are scapegoated and attacked. So just one story, because we are in Norway and that's relevant to your country. One of our important resources of funding as NGOs were the so-called Norwegian grant. The Norway is giving money because in return to being able to use the common market of the European Union. So it was like more than 200 million euros grant going to Hungary between 2014 and 2017, and 5% of that goes to the NGOs. But our government blocked this money completely because they didn't want NGOs like us receiving any money from this. And there was a kind of Cold War between Norwegian and Hungarian government as a consequence of that. And the police went to the office of one of the organizations who were distributing before the Norwegian grant money, and they were seizing computers, and they made an investigation against NGOs. And this is just one example. We also had a so-called foreign agent law, where NGOs are required to register as a kind of foreign agent. So things are not very nice in this part of Europe. So I think in the end, in the European Union, the main question we have to ask is what kind of Europe we want to live in. I mean, is it just a loose economic coalition, or do we really want a European Union that stands up for human rights and democracy? And I think this is very important, that if we really want to see a European level drug policy reform, that it is inseparable for the issue of civil society and democracy. So we need to do that. And that was it. Thank you for your attention.